So, so welcome everybody to the Healthy Planet Action Coalition. It's a bi-monthly general meeting, and we generally have speakers at these meetings, and we've had some very distinguished speakers, and including today. But before I introduce Mike, uh, I just want to note that anyone who wants to join our Google group, who is listening to this or at this meeting, please email us. You can email me, rpbayman@gmail.com, or anyone else on the steering committee, and we will put you on the, most of us have that ability to put you on the in the Google group if you're interested. We have many recordings of prior sessions, including David Keith and Doug McMartin and numerous other people. So those are all or will be Alan Gadian on our website. Those recordings are available. Okay, without further ado, let me introduce Mike MacCracken, who I have to say has been generously spending a lot of his time on the steering circle of HPAC recently. But prior to his retirement, he was let me just go through his career here. Some of you may have seen he graduated from Princeton University in 1964 and got a PhD at University of California, Davis. He led climate change studies at the Department of Energy's Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory from 1968 to 93, and then served as senior scientist with the Interagency Office of the U.S. Global Change Research Program from 1993 to 2002. Successively as the executive director of the office from 1993 to 97, and executive director of the first U.S. National Assessment Coordination Office from 1997 to 2001. In addition, he served as president of the International Association of Meteorology and Atmospheric Sciences from 2003 to 2007. And in addition to participating in other international science activities since the 1970s, I believe that those federal agencies were the precursors to the current, is it the White House Office of Science and Technology? Mike can clarify that. But in any case, I think Mike was without question one of the top federal scientists for many years, and we are very fortunate to have him. And he's going to speak on decision-making frameworks as a contributor to contention on climate change. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Mike.
Okay. Thank you. Let's see. I need to start screen sharing here, Bob. My intent to speak today is really to help try and figure out if we can better communicate our message. As Ron said, I was a scientist at Livermore Lab, studied climate change. Did a dissertation in the 1960s, actually, with what's now called an intermediate complexity model. And we were looking at human effects. One of them ended up being greenhouse gases. And if you go on YouTube and do a search, you can actually find a talk I gave, I think, in 1981 at Sandia National Laboratories about climate change. And you'll see that some of the graphs I used are actually still used today. There's the Mauna Loa record, and there's some other ones. So I came with a scientific background to Washington and the Office of the U.S. Global Change Research Program. And yeah, there we go. What I found as I did that, let's see if I can go here. What I found is all kinds of different opinions. I thought when I came, oh, we have the science in pretty good shape. The first IPCC report is out. The second one was actually done. We had a good sense of scientific understanding. And in Washington, yet there were all kinds of different views, not just about scientific findings and uncertainties, but how it affected energy, about stewardship, technological progress, balancing of economic costs and everything. And I was trying to know what in the world is going on. And I sort of tried to look at it as a scientist and figure out, well, what is it that it is leading to these different views? One of the prevailing explanations over the past that developed was done by pollsters, and they basically came up with this idea of the six Americas. Let's see if I can get some of these things off of here, right? They came up with a notion of six Americas. There are the people sort of grouped into six different ones: dismissive, doubtful, disengaged, cautious, concerned, and alarmed. That's all well and good, but it really doesn't help us talk much about how to communicate with these people. How do we get across? Why did they come to their particular views? And there's been a lot of discussion about trying to do it and everything, but I wanted to sort of look a little bit deeper. I was working on this before they came up with this view, but I wanted to be a little bit deeper here. And so one of the considerations I sort of looked at is what might be considered the legal framing for it. Maybe people just have a different view of how confident the scientific community is and must be for something. So some people are out there saying, I don't want any uncertainty. I want to be certain, or beyond a reasonable doubt enough, whatever that is. Administrative hearings in the United States are based on clear and convincing evidence, which is said to mean a likelihood of something like 70 to 75%. Civil trials in the United States are based on a preponderance of the evidence, but that actually is taken to mean 51% or greater. So it's not the highest level confidence. You can keep going down there. EPA, when it's making rulings about whether it will allow toxic substances, will often say if a chemical poses more than 1 in a 10,000 chance of cancer or something, that's enough to take action. Well, certainly with respect to climate change, we're well above of that level of understanding. But so what is it? Some people want to wait until you have demonstrable absence of sort of negative impacts on taking action or something. There's just a whole range of conditions, and this didn't really satisfy me either about what was happening. So I sort of wanted to try and look at this issue of what is creating these differences on decision-making frameworks. What is it that is causing people to come up this way? Now, I'm not an expert in the field, and so this is just sort of a scientist looking at the field and trying to pull out some points and things. And I'm probably going to be oversimplifying and generalizing and things. And part of that will be a result of most people actually have combined or have their different framings a little bit, and sometimes they use different framings on different issues, which is perfectly acceptable and understood. And let me say, I'm going through these framings, 8 or 10 of them. They all have a particular rationale. Indeed, the people who come to them with these things think that this should be the rationale that everybody should use, and they sort of dismiss other rationales about it. And they sometimes throw mud into the machine by denigrating other perspectives. We've heard that certainly happened with the fossil fuel industry doing that, sort of supporting some scientists and sort of featuring their views and not anybody else's. But I think using the pejorative doomers to talk about the viewpoints that some people had is another example of sort of denigrating a view because the people don't agree with it. So it's important to try and figure out where people are coming from. Another problem has been that, especially, I think it's been the case in the IPCC, they aren't very good at explaining the decision frameworks that are being used in putting together the documents. I've often put in reviewer comments saying, please explain what the basis is and what you mean by doing that. The IPCC did come up with sort of its approach about it, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So let me say up front, I'm coming at this in my discussion as sort of a scientist, trying to be an explainer rather than an advocate of some particular framing and everything. I mean, I certainly end up having some framing, and so, but I'm going to come at it initially as a scientist doing it. So if you think about the scientific tradition, it basically calls for achieving a high confidence in findings, and that's nominally to ensure that this wonderful pyramid of knowledge we are building is rock solid and doesn't have any cracks. And it ensures that I know what the path is from cause to effect. I've got to rigorously establish it. I just can't do correlations. I've got to explore alternatives, causes, and explanations, and try and rule them out. So you don't want multiple kinds of explanations. Then that's considered uncertainty. So I want to have a finding of something like beyond 95% confidence, which is basically saying I want 20-to-1 odds in my favor if I were going to bet on a horse race, but there's one other qualification. I don't want any other horse in the race. And so understand that's where scientists come from. That's in some sense how journal articles are judged. Scientists do this because they don't want to be wrong. They want to keep the credibility of the community, tradition. And we've had some examples of it. And so a violation of it occurred back in the 1950s and 60s with approval in Europe of a medicine called thalidomide. This was to help make it easier for pregnant women. It sort of settled their stomachs, and they went ahead and approved this. It was not approved, I don't think, in the United States, but there were some indications of the medicine coming over here. And what did it lead to? It led to some terrible cases of deformed children and babies being born. And it was a terrible legacy. And I think that led the scientific community, especially the medical community, to really say, we've got to be absolutely confident about it. We sort of experienced that in this last COVID crisis. They didn't approve medicine for the dose of the vaccine for the kids until they way along. I mean, there were children dying and suffering. And I'm not going to approve the issuance of COVID because we haven't proven absolutely it's confident. There's also been, of course, some disruption of this. That kind of ruling sort of leads the scientific community to say its standards are etched in stone and shouldn't be changed. But there have been some exemptions, and that occurred during the HIV/AIDS crisis. The people who had HIV/AIDS and were sort of on a path to death went to the medical community and said, if you have any medicines that have any hope of being useful, even if you haven't proven it, you've got to make them available to us. And that because they said, what worse can happen to us? We're going to die anyway. So let us at least try a medicine if there's some indication of hope. Don't hold off. And that's led to laws that sort of have to do with a compassionate exemption that exists, so that if there are diseases that are very tough, the medical community will let people into trials and try and do that. But realize the scientific tradition is don't agree to anything unless you have high confidence in it. And the sort of hypothesis that was laid out on which this was applied in climate change was humans aren't influencing the climate, so you have to prove beyond confidence that they are. Instead of having it phrased the other way, it's phrased that you have to prove that humans are having that. And you're hearing that now about you have to prove that particular storm was contributing something. It's something that the scientific community is very much doing. There has been some sort of pushback on that because the way scientists frame things are sometimes hard to understand. And so the working groups developed a lexicon for explaining their findings. It mainly applies to working group 1. Jerry Malman, who was a modeler, sort of started some of this out by talking about odds, but they put it in this way. So they have this lexicon of virtually certain to very unlikely and all those other things. They don't even want to say they're certain to the public until you have, when you have greater than 99% probability. Wow. Very likely is greater than 90%. And so there is this lexicon. Some have objected that how can the IPCC does use specific numbers in working group 1. A number of us objected and said, you can't possibly get down to 2 significant figures on this. You should be using maybe 9 chances out of 10, roughly 9 chances out of 10 for the 90 to 99 or something. But realize that's what they come out with, and what IPCC and others tend to focus on are things that are well established. So in the upper set of this kinds of things, they don't talk much about the unlikely, and yet that has up to a 1/3 chance of happening, a 1 in 3 chance of happening. Scientists are putting forward a very cautious metric about what happens, and it's important to keep that in mind. And the metric they're using, namely global average temperature, is a very understated metric given the existential threat. Basically, it's averaged for a decade or more before they actually come to the ruling. It's time lagged. It's not projected with a linear increase to the present. It includes the oceans. And so that tends to moderate the amount of change to a great deal. It isn't really what the people are experiencing. It doesn't capture the variation with latitude. So the metric the negotiators use doesn't include polar amplification, really. It's based on annual average conditions when most results occur on short-term variations in the weather extremes. So it really fails to capture extremes. It's daily averaged, and realize the daily average temperature is taken in a sun-shaded shelter. So it's not like people being out in the open with the sun on you. It doesn't account for heat index. It doesn't sort of note that the rise in the minimum temperature is occurring and that has an undue impact on health. It doesn't let people cool down at night. And it really doesn't talk about other variables. So this was a wonderful variable when the scientific community in the 80s and early 90s was trying to establish, are humans really affecting the climate? But in terms of talking about what the significance is to the country as a whole, it's a very cautious metric to be using. So what are some of the other views? Well, one of the other perspectives, and it got a lot of attention and probably was partly responsible when the IPCC was formed, has been the fossil fuel interests. And when they're speaking, really in the purest way, their argument is that, or at least has been, that the fossil fuels provide 80% of the world's energy. It's relatively low cost. It provides energy day and night. It's relatively concentrated, so it can help fly airplanes. It's safe, readily storable, transportable, and there's infrastructure around the world. It's supporting the standard of living of people around the world, and everything. So it's a very important thing. And they basically say switching to other technologies, whether it's nuclear or renewables, though renewables are now lower in cost, has very large upfront costs, and switching money resources of society to changing technology or diverting resources from other problems like poverty, health, and economic development. Now, a number of us would say, well, it's not sort of that money gets diverted and other things, but that was sort of the argument they were making. I should have said, going back, the way the scientists get around their problem of high uncertainty is they come out with a range of results. And so you have scientists saying the warming from now to 2100, we could have 1 degree to 5 degrees in 2100. And so that way they won't be wrong, because they're not likely to be wrong because they have such a big range. And that keeps them sort of true to trying to be credible. The fossil fuel energy response to that is to say, well, 1 degree is all you're agreed is can really happen. That's all you're certain of. And we can deal with 1 degree out to 2100, and it would be more harmful to get rid of the fossil fuel system than to experience 1 degree. And so that has sort of been their approach. Pat Michaels kept saying, I do my linear extrapolation from warming from 1970 to 1990. It gets out to 1 degree. In 2100, we can adapt to that. That has been where a lot of the sort of people called deniers or skeptics got picked up. Whoops, sorry. So there is a view. Now they have gone and thrown a bit of mud sometimes by supporting scientists who don't sort of talk and accept criticisms of themselves, but there is a view that they have. You're hearing, at least where we are in Washington, we're hearing it all the time right now in advertising about Biden doing too much on climate and it all should be repealed, and let's go to America's energy, which means fossil fuels. Now, there's also a lot of environmental perspectives out there. They're based on sort of a notion that we have only one planet. That's our spaceship Earth. We have to apply the precautionary principle that's been embedded in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which means, don't take actions that could cause harm, and you should do a great deal to avoid that harm. And presenting their case, they will pick out the scientific result and say, well, scientists say it could be as much as 5 degrees C by 2100. With many other adverse consequences, we, of course, have to do just tremendous actions to try and prevent that, because we can't allow that kind of large change to occur. It is traditional for them to sort of look at worst case. It isn't, there was a paper a decade or two ago called The End of Environmentalism, which criticized all the environmental groups for choosing the upper value, because that value never came to be true. So they're not telling us the truth, was their argument. What wasn't pointed out was the numbers they were choosing were from scientists, not numbers that they picked out of the air. It was from scientists, and scientists were choosing that high number because they didn't want to be wrong. And so they just sort of chose some high scenarios and everything about what happened. So these are all sort of tied together and everything. So it's an argument about looking to future generations, but I'll come to that in a minute too. So I did a paper back in 2006, I guess it was, that sort of explained the ones I've mentioned and other ones. But one of the groups I failed to understand and ended up leaving out was the business, investment, infrastructure, and national security sort of communities in society. They do something, and I gather it's taught in business school, that you apply a due diligence decision-making framework. And what that in essence means is you ought to make sure your business, your operation, whatever you install in infrastructure, your policies, are resilient to the worst plausible outcome. And so that's being resilient to a run on a bank, I mean, saw a controversy this year when a bank or two sort of couldn't withstand that. Oh my, wow, all kinds of things happened. You saw it with the mortgage crisis and everything. Laws were passed, make sure banks go through tests. They've got to be resilient to this type of outcome. Investment funds, especially for retirement funds like the Norwegian pension fund, you got to be resilient to the oscillations of the economy and the stock market. You're supposed to be providing money in the future to retirees and to invest their ones. And so you have to have you want very solid investments. That's what you consider. Infrastructure builders have chosen the 1 in 100-year flood standard, for example. The Dutch, however, for their levees and everything they have, chose a 1 in 10,000-year flood. I mean, they don't want to be flooded. They had that experience in the 50s and it was disastrous. For the military planner, it should say simultaneous conflicts in the Atlantic and Pacific. Being prepared for that is why the U.S. Defense Department is so big. And it's recalling World War II and having to do that. And so has to have Atlantic fleets and Pacific fleets and be able to do everything. And it ends up being a huge priority. So that's where there's a whole community coming from that. And because they have done this, they've actually provided a reasonably stable framework for society to develop. You don't want to have floods in a community wiping it out every couple of decades. You don't want to have dams collapsing or other kinds of things. And so there has been this attempt to prepare for this. And that's been their standard. That's been their tradition. Unfortunately, it turns out they haven't been living up to that in the view of a number of us. And the reason they haven't been living up to it is because IPCC scientists aren't able to tell them what the worst plausible outcomes might be. In all their experience, those are traditionally gathered from an analysis of the past, not projections into the future. And scientists can't be confident about the worst plausible outcomes, so they haven't been putting those out. Really on the IPCC list of things, this would be down in the very unlikely and very unlikely categories. And IPCC doesn't pay much attention to those. It likes to rule those out. They want to talk about high confidence. This group wants to look at what are the risks and to try and be resilient to those. So I learned a lot about this in collaboration with a business fellow. A former CEO was just appalled that the business community wasn't responding, and we tried to figure out why, and came up with the view that their decision-making framework is different than the scientific community. And this fellow, Dave Tattersall, who has been basically positive, he sort of think of ourselves, the few of us who are involved, as the consultants to a board of directors of a hypothetical business called Earth Incorporated. And what he does in trying to communicate is he puts together a balance sheet for the corporation and a money flow thing that is looking over time at the growing unfunded mandate, in particular in our field, these negative emissions that are called for, where we don't really know how to do it up to the scale we're talking about, and who's going to pay for it. And so he sort of uses this business tradition of doing that and thinks about, well, how would bonds for this we need to make an investment to try and save planet Earth. What would the rating be on bonds? If you go look at what the standards are for bonds and rating, planet Earth Earth Incorporated would have bond ratings of junk bonds right now. It really doesn't have a plan to try and continue. We're just sort of continuing on. So Dave and a group of colleagues, which is being helped by Sir David King as well, is working to speak to international banking, investment, and other communities, saying, hey, you really need to be looking at the worst plausible case realities of climate change. I mean, Greta Thunberg is sort of out there paying attention to the science, and And that's all well and good, but the real thing to pay attention to is the risks that are out there. So the worst plausible kind of cases. And it's interesting, Dave's quite frank about why he's going to these groups. Oops. Where did I go here? Because they're the ones with the money. And he's sort of a practical fellow and says, well, money talks. So let's go to the ones with the money and see if we can convince them that if they were doing their due diligence as they should, so that they can continue their wealth and good situation into the future, they would be demanding much more action from politicians. So there is that sort of path going on here. So there are a number of other ones I'll go through pretty quickly here. There are the sort of engineering community that is optimistic and is convinced that it can provide solutions, and they don't pay much attention to uncertainties. They sort of look at the central value and say, if you supply us the funds, we can come up with solutions. That was sort of most evident in the 1950s, when if you invested in nuclear power, it was going to be free electricity for everybody. But nowadays, what you hear is about small nuclear, you hear about fusion, you hear about other new technologies. Just invent enough and we can do it. Solar and wind have been paying off, which is wonderful. But there is this notion that just invest more in technology. And so we're doing the big investment in tokamaks and other things for things. It is nice we're making some progress, and you certainly want to, I think, help pitch technological progress or use of technology. There are an awful lot of people out there. Is nuclear in the plan or something like that? And everything. It's an interesting debate and viewpoint, and you will hear that out there about it. Another one is, apologies, Ron, or maybe you'll agree with me, is the traditional view of economists, which is to do sort of cost-benefit analyses. And when those are done, they basically say money is the main object. Let's look at the progress society has made, look at what's going to cost. And they put an economic cost on everything. The utility value of human life, a community, a fishery. Now, many of you may not remember, I think it was in the first IPCC assessment, maybe one of the other ones, there was a huge controversy over this cost of a human life. It was a British economist who was doing an analysis to try and say, well, these are the impacts and what it'll cost. And there were some impacts that led to death or illness. And he said, well, how are we going to figure out the utility value of human life? Well, you look at lifetime earnings, for example, and how what earnings are lost. And he basically said, well, in the developed countries, it's $1 million a life, and in the developing countries, it's $100,000 a life. That caused, not surprisingly, a rather huge controversy, including a number of people from developing countries picketing his office in England. But the economists actually do try and sometimes put a value on everything. And, the problem is, let's say sea level is going to rise and over and inundate islands and a culture in the Pacific. Well, if that's going to happen in 50 years, and I use a traditional discount rate of several percent, it has nearly no present value. Whereas the costs of making changes in energy technologies are upfront capital costs to a large extent. And so the traditional economic community was just sort of, well, we can just put off change. We'll wait, because later in time, that will result in a less cost to society for doing this. It was a very strange thing. It led to sort of a mistaken approach in doing one of the comparisons of integrated assessment models, where they said, what they do is they do an Excel optimization, and they optimized on getting to 2 watts per meter squared in 2100. What's the least expensive path to do that? Well, the least expensive path with respect to, say, black carbon is don't start and impose your standards until 2099, because black carbon disappears from the atmosphere in a few weeks. And so if I impose my technologies in 2099, which will be great by then, with any reasonable discount rate, I can make 2 watts per meter squared. And they sort of forgot about the fact that, well, all this century, black carbon is going to cause warming. And the real issue is warming, not what the forcing is in 2100. And so they did this with respect to methane. They did it with respect to some other kinds of things. You could even overshoot in methane. And as long as you started methane controls in the 2080s, you could get methane down by 2100 with these advanced technologies. So this issue of economic value is important, but there is then the question of what you value and exactly how you do that. And so it's important to sort of check what people do. So I first was doing some of this back in 2002, and that was a time when equity, the religious community at least, was interested in issues of equity and fairness. Now the environmental justice group has sprung up much more strongly, but there are really interesting views that come out. I was involved as a sort of scientific advisor to the panel of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops that put together their rationale. And as they were going through their 30-some drafts of what they were going to say, they were trying to figure out, well, what can the Catholic bishops say that will have credibility? I mean, would they have credibility on the science? No. Credibility on economics? Probably not. What would they have credibility on? And the issues they came to focus on were equity and fairness. So equity in terms of the rich versus the poor in this country, in the US, the US versus other countries, and this generation versus future generations, and then the issue of stewardship and the responsibility of preserving the environment. I didn't put in here what the sort of indigenous view is, but I was also at that time a liaison to an indigenous group. And their perspective is also quite different. They basically consider humans as part of nature instead of separate from nature. And one of the campaigns going on back then, perhaps still going on, was that I was asked to pass along to this conference of Catholic bishops was the Pope should repeal the papal bull of 1493. It took me a while to figure out what was going on and why it was, but that was when the Spanish king and Pope, I guess it was, set out this idea that nature is for human development, whereas indigenous peoples have quite a different view about property ownership. You don't own the land and you're part of it and everything. And so, again, it's important to understand where people are coming from as you try and communicate with them. Another one that was quite active back then was expressed most by Vice President Cheney. And his recommendations at the time were to build 800 coal-fired power plants and get the US off of oil coming from the Middle East so he could pull the military back. So his was a national security or a America first kind of approach and strategy. Really didn't care much about what happened to the rest of the world. He didn't want to be sort of imposing, requiring us to protect seaways around the world. But it was important. I mean, he was basically saying, look, we want to be free of energy. And he was trying to make sure that we reduce the burden on the military. So he had his views, forget the rest of them on the environment. And sort of getting to closing, let me just say that the media hasn't necessarily been much help in all of this. The media doesn't have much time. Certainly not much time to present complexities and nuances when the problems is complicated. And what they've often done is say, well, we're going to present two sides. That's what there are to this issue. And they would sort of randomly go out and pick two from about the 8 or 10 different perspectives that exist. And so you might have a scientist talking about their results, and you'd have a lawyer who's paid for by the fossil fuel companies out offering their view. And they come with very different perspectives about things. And the media would not explain what the perspectives were. Sometimes, what is it, the old statement, where you stand depends on where you sit. And the where you sit part for some of the denier group that was up there. I mean, Fred Singer, for example, used to say, I'm president of this entity. Well, that entity was Fred Singer. And the only other person involved in that entity was his wife, who was secretary. It wasn't an entity, but it was a wonderful title to have below his participation when he was on TV for 20 seconds or 30 seconds and two sides offering views, because he got credibility from the title. Scientists generally don't like to get credibility from the title they have. They want to explain, and that takes a long time. So, so the media wasn't very, I'm not sure. Somebody asking a question, I'll get to it in a minute here. Then let me just say something about national and international leaders. The idea would be if they could listen to all these different viewpoints and perspectives and come together with an integrated perspective on it. They want sort of a single kind of way of pulling it together. They want to know, give us the relative likelihood and an evaluation, and that's what we're going to know. And Senator Muskie once got very fed up with scientists talking at hearings he was running and said, I want to have I want to find a one-armed scientist. A scientist doesn't say, well, on one hand it's this, and on another hand it's this. It could be 1 degree, it could be 5 degrees. Give me the relative likelihood to deal with that. And in some sense, that leads to a choice of just one result. And that's part of the problem of the present set of negotiations. They're focused on one likely line and not so much the uncertainties around it. But you need these leaders to try and build a consensus that recognizes the voices, that says, yes, you coal miners played an important role in the development of the country, but now we have to change. Would you like your kids working not in the coal mines, but on something else? And so you have to put together things. Some leaders have tried to do that. Al Gore was one. I'm sorry, I keep getting out of here, something like that. Al Gore was one who talks about the science. He got to learn the science. He talks about the moral and ethical values. He talks about risks. He presents extremes and stuff, but he's had trouble being partisan, being seen as partisan reactions, and a lot of attention is partisan. So when I put out, I'm sorry. So the situation we face with all of this is that if you talk to the public, they basically want a lot of different things, and it's a bit controversial. They're sort of in conflict. They want high scientific confidence, even scientific certainty they talk about, but it's hard because the future is uncertain. They want abundant and inexpensive energy. They want clean and healthy and stable environment. They want new technology. I mean, they generally will accept new technologies. They want the costs of their necessities to be low. They're sort of interested in fairness, but they're not quite sure what that really involves. They want good relations with the world, and we want our politicians to make this problem go away. So you go, whoa, how are we going to figure out how to do that and make that happen? And so there are communications going on from this group, and you can think about them. I mean, this one for bad, the one about bad science and what the real situation is that, as essentially a transmission of a paper from a group that is sometimes labeled doomers. That's really not a fair statement, but that's what they're labeled when they're really trying to do and look at the risks involved. What are the real risks about what are the worst plausible outcomes? And they talk about worst plausible outcomes about what's happening to the Arctic and whatever. So, in some sense, that's a really important bridge to get to. Can we build a link to the climate negotiators? I mean, I think an early mistake in setting up IPCC was who got power to write the summary for policymakers. Veto power was given to the scientific community, essentially, instead of having it come in with a view of the risk-based due diligence community, and that would talk about, well, this is what disrupts societal stability and stuff. Somehow the scientists are unwilling to agree that they're framing it. I mean, they think it's carved in stone, and really it's a choice. It's a we don't want to be wrong, and so that's the framing we think we should use. It seems to me, and so I think we can build a partnership or collaboration. I think it will also help the environmental activists if what they could get in touch with were those who are advocating the engineering and technology solution. So they were really advocating for things that will solve problems, and that instead of sometimes being seen as saying, well, just stop using fossil fuels or something. How are you going to sustain the lives of 8 billion people on Earth? And we have to figure out the technologies to do that and be encouraging it and get the things that are blocking that out of the way. And to do it all, I guess it would sure be nice to have some credible leaders out there. As I said, Al Gore tried. There was a parade a number of us wanted to start during the Obama years because he could have been out there leading it along with the Pope, the Secretary General of the UN, the head of the World Bank, and if there were some industry leader, it would have been a very interesting parade saying that things have to happen. So we really need a sort of broad and strong choir of inspiring voices to get action. So I just think that understanding where people are coming from and trying to figure out how to link to them. Catherine Hayhoe talks about that. She talks to people in the religious community who think, who could change God's great earth or something like that. You want to empathize with people first, be part of that group, help build bridges, and then go where we have to go. So that's sort of what I wanted to cover. As I say, I'm not an expert. I'd be interested in hearing other views and reactions.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. Yes, I think it's an excellent talk. As is usually our custom, I'll just take speakers in the order in which people raise their hands. And I see here, Robert, I think you're first.
Thanks very much, Mike. Let's see. A great talk, just very excellent framing. I want to go through a couple of notes that I took as you were talking. The problem is that in the legal analogy that you described, the punishment has to fit the crime. And if a required sentence is very harsh, then a jury is more cautious about convicting. And the situation is that decarbonizing is a much harsher sentence than the consequences of brightening the planet with solar geoengineering. And so that's helps to frame it. And the climate uncertainty, I would say, is mainly not around whether anthropogenic climate change is real, but rather about whether decarbonizing will cool the planet. And the problem is, as recent work is coming to grips with, is that it just won't. And so the denial mentality that you described, I thought that those 6 categories were really useful. It just says the punishment doesn't fit the crime. You're calling on us to destroy our economy, and but the benefits of decarbonization are minimal in terms of its impact on temperature. So and then again, that scientific framing of whether the problem is virtually certain through to whether it's exceptionally unlikely. And so I would put it to say that to say climate change is anthropogenic, that's virtually certain. But to say that emission reduction alone could mitigate climate change, that's exceptionally unlikely. It's just not going to happen. So what that means is that the adaptation scenarios need to include the option that we're going to continue high fossil fuel use, and we're going to mitigate it with geoengineering. And then what the science is needed is to say, okay, in that scenario, what is the acidification and pollution implications of just accepting that we're going to live with ongoing emissions? So I would say that the primary, the ethical debate that you referenced has not been soundly based, because the primary ethical risk that we face is system collapse. And so that the mass suffering, the species extinction that's going to come from unmitigated climate change is the primary ethical risk, which says that we really need to brighten the planet as soon as possible in order to step back from these tipping points. And so, like when Michael Mann says stratospheric aerosol injection, etc., is a doomer mentality, he's just totally wrong. He's totally out of line, because there are doomers out there who are saying we're in a situation of collapse and there's nothing we can do. And the point is that we say there is something we can do. We can enhance planetary albedo, and that will pull us back from the precipice of tipping points.
Robert, do you have okay. I'm not sure what the question was, but Mike.
Well, I'll let Mike respond, please.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to say there are different voices out there. So we just had in the U.S. Congress, the House of Representatives just held a hearing on climate. They don't even agree it exists. Okay. I mean, they haven't picked that up. They're basically often from states that have fossil fuel resources. They're coming at it with a different perspective. And yet the Washington Post did a really interesting study which said, if you look at how much of the funds of the Inflation Reduction Act are going into these districts where people are saying, no, climate isn't real, all sorts of those funds are going into those districts and states to do things. And so, I mean, even in our new head of the House, Speaker of the House, they go to his district. Funds are going to his district so that the people who used to take oil drilling materials out in the Gulf of Mexico are taking out platforms for windmills. I mean, and that's a good part of the economy going on in his district. And yet they're not even willing to agree on it. And so they're coming from a particular perspective where they come from. I mean, I used to go around when I was in foreign countries, I would get questions about when President Bush and Cheney were there. They'd say, well, why isn't the US agreeing to Kyoto? You know, why aren't they sort of agreeing to take this on? And I said, well, let me ask you a couple of questions about the US and see how much you know. Do you know what state the president is from? Okay, well, he's from Texas. Why is that important? Because Texas, by a factor of several, has the largest emissions of CO2. I'm not saying that he was bribed or whatever, but his whole mind perspective is on fossil fuels having come from Texas. Do you know what state Vice President Cheney is from?
Wyoming.
He's from Wyoming.
Right.
Wyoming has one of the highest per capita CO2 emissions in the country. Okay. That's his, and then he moved to Texas or something. I mean, that's their mindset is CO2, and it's important to understand it. And so just going about anti-CO2 for them is hard. And so one has to appeal to what are the other reasons to try and get over it. So I'm just trying to say, I mean, I don't disagree with your arguments at all. I mean, about some of these things. But I think one just has to figure out how to make the case without necessarily denigrating him and making him as opponents to you. You know, I mean, you know, it is really troubling what Michael Mann keeps just addicted to this view that we can still meet the 1.5 degree standard. And he looks in all kinds of things because that hasn't been ruled out yet. Yeah, but you know, what is the likelihood of it? I mean, so we're convinced that it can't be done, but But what is the likelihood that that can be done? That after 30 years of emissions still going up, you can suddenly go down and get rid of them in 7 years or something like that. Really? I mean, so I think one has to try and understand framings and try and figure out how to appeal to them in relatively interesting ways. Let me say that the business investment group that I'm sort of part of, so which is a climate change due diligence, is a sort of another NGO that's out there. It's of the conclusion that, yeah, intervention is just absolutely essential if you're going to do it, that there just aren't ways to do things fast enough to save Earth Inc. if you're doing it. But they basically talk in sort of business terminology to them. They show this balance sheet, which is what consultants do. That's what those people look at. So instead of making an argument one way, they basically are trying to change the language and come in another way. So can you think about the group and what its language is and how you communicate with them is a question.
Thank you, Mark. Gregory, I think you're up, and if folks could try and make their remarks concise, just to make sure everybody gets a chance here. Although we have about half an hour.
I'll try to,
yeah. Thank you. Okay, Gregory.
Okay, thanks. Nice talk. Thank you. On your last slide and what you've been talking about just before is trying to reach out, and you mentioned Catherine Hayhoe, others. The problem as I see it is that the mentality of that, from the perspective of our side, let's say, is that we know what the truth is. We know the right answer. We just have to convince these morons, benighted morons, and they understand that. I mean, they are just as convinced that we're morons as we're convinced they're morons. I use that pejorative, but so the difficulty of the reach out is that it's a reach out from a patronizing perspective in some sense. If you'll just listen to me, we can educate you and you'll get it. That's the problem with the reach out as far as I'm concerned. Go ahead.
No, I think that's exactly right. And the question is how to avoid that situation, how to try and do it. I mean, I like on this bad science paper that they just put forth. I think they were aiming it at the right people, that is the negotiators trying to explain the position. But I thought it was, I tried to get them to change the title and a couple of other words in there, because saying bad science, the natural reaction is going to be, what do you mean? We have the best scientific authority in the whole world that's gone through review, and they're providing us all the best information. So why should I read this 50 or 60 pages that you're offering me, or even the 3-page summary or whatever it is? If they had said, and I tried to get them to change to something like, not as catchy, over-optimistic presumptions instead of bad science. So don't try and do it. But if you say that, then you've switched who the burden of proof is. I mean, if with their phrasing, they have to prove that it's bad science. No, if you switch the title to something like, over optimistic presumptions or something similar, and there are phrases that you can use, then the burden becomes on to try and prove that those aren't over-optimistic presumptions, that those are actually realistic. And so you switch the burden of proof around by how you phrase things. And I was trying, I mean, they also have in there fallacy and fact. Okay. Golly, they have to prove all their things as facts. Well, if you pose a scientific standard to that, that's proving everything to 95% confidence. If you say emerging consensus, or you say something else, then the burden of proof starts to switch. So I think the language you choose can affect who has the upper hand and who's being questioned and stuff. And so you need to be thinking about that in how you and how you do that. And I think that may be able to help. I don't know. I mean, I've had this view and we still haven't gotten use change, but
Yeah, thank you. I think that paper, it's in preprint phase, and they're still, at least saying they're open to further suggestions. So,
well,
but
no,
I know you've tried, but yeah,
I had my comment in time in there, and it's fine to
Yeah.
say they publish, they're going to change the title, but this is their chance to go to the negotiators, who are the ones whose opinion you want to change. You want to get them to say, no, the scientific tradition of thinking that they've been relying on is not carved in stone, and they have a responsibility, a broader responsibility, to think about society as a whole.
Yeah. No, I think it's an excellent point, Mike. Thank you. Robert, Chris.
Right, that was a superb presentation, Mike, and so many things that one could talk about. I'm going to limit myself to one issue, which has always strikes me as being at the heart of the difficulty of making progress here, and that is that at the end of the day, there is a group of decision makers, people actually who part the waves for everybody to go through, and those decision makers have a problem, a systemic problem, and that is that they like to do good stuff for people, and they don't like to harm people. And they certainly don't like to be seen to be harming people. And they don't like to be adopting policies that they know are going to harm people. So there is a tendency to favor what economists call Pareto optimal solutions. So these are solutions where some will benefit, maybe lots of people will benefit, but no one will be harmed. And it kind of opens up the question about whether or not climate change has now progressed to the point where it is even conceivable that any kind of viable route forward that would significantly lessen the threats from climate change could ever be Pareto optimal. That there is a path out of this that doesn't involve actually knowingly and deliberately hurting some people for the benefit of the greater good. And once you adopt that attitude as a decision maker, then you have an obligation to look after the people that you're going to harm. You have to offer them compensation. You have to offer them some kind of protection. When your island floods, we will accommodate you. You can move and live in our country. When your cities are awash with water, we will provide the finance to rebuild them. There is a kind of chasm in here, which I think that policymakers, decision makers, have not adequately addressed. And I actually find it one of the things that causes me greatest difficulty is seeing a way forward in which policymakers could actually recognize that issue and deal with it in a constructive and collaborative manner. I know what your thought. I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Well, no, that's a very interesting point, and I guess my first reaction was to suggest, it may be that what happens is we have to just promote all these technologies where they are particularly useful and will provide benefits. I mean, one of the groups I'm part of has been promoting a U.S. national high voltage direct current transmission network as a complement to what we have, because that's the way you can move electricity across the country at low cost from the renewable regions, which are often far from the demand centers. And it's clearly a global, it would be a national benefit. I mean, right now, the proposal, what I'm forgetting his name, Mark Jacobson at Stanford is, every small region in the United States has the capability to put in enough renewables and go completely green on its own. Well, that may be true, but the investment to do that is huge. So a much less expensive one is to share it across the country. And right now we have a electric transmission grid that is equivalent to the old US highway system, which wouldn't get you more than a state or two in a day, as opposed to the interstate highway system. And what you need is this interstate highway system for electricity and create a national market. The trouble is trying to do something national all at once is really hard. And so there are thoughts of starting it out by some special lines, by figuring out where it would really be helpful to create alliance. And once these other areas see the benefits of it, then they would agree to join up or something. So you may have to break it down in parts and try and do it. Actually, this fellow who proposed it, Sandy McDonald, has a book that's in preparation to go to a publisher that basically argues every continent should have a high voltage direct current network to move stuff around. There's no reason you couldn't power Europe with solar coming from the Sahara Desert area, and get it up there. High voltage direct current is good at long distance transmission, and I think there's actually a cable going in from sort of below Morocco up to the UK or something like that to try and do that. We need to create a way of moving renewables around. It's one of the very few products in society, electricity, for which there isn't a large marketplace, for which the marketplaces are pretty small. When we did the interstate highway system, we made basically everything into a national marketplace, and it allowed products to get everywhere all the time to everybody, and stuff. And that's what one needs to do. But getting that done, I mean, my view, and a suggestion to some, has been the way to do with the loss and damage demands of, say, of Africa, is to say, well, the West should put in, or the developed nation should put in, such a network in Africa so that every country has sufficient electricity coming into it in amounts that would it has to build off an AC network or something to go local, but has enough electricity come in that its economy can develop and it can participate in the world, so it has enough money eventually to be dealing with on its own with loss and damage. Because I think the idea of saying forever the developed countries will provide money to the developing countries on loss and damage is not, I don't know. We'll see at COP28 if that has a chance, but it seems a little implausible to me. So can you help them to develop? And such a network might help do it. But anyway, I think you're exactly right. There's a question of what level of leadership do we do? Do you pay attention to it more locally and try and lead locally rather than internationally? Might that work better? I don't know. Art, good question.
Thank you, Mike. Charlie, sure. We can't hear you, Charlie. You have to turn the volume up, maybe? Nope, still can't hear you.
Ron, we might have to move on to a next person.
Yeah,
Charlie
okay.
up his system.
Charlie, we're gonna move on, and then raise your, see if you can put something in a chat or something if you figured out the problem. Okay, Aria.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much, Mike, for this. This is obviously a super important conversation. I put some things in the chat that I just want to mention and call people's attention to. I've been focused quite a bit on the social end of this when it comes to why people are so reticent to really align themselves and get on board with the mission. There was a really fascinating meeting I was on with Covering Climate Now the other day. And I really want to call out the organization is doing some really wonderful work. And they certainly are, I think, behind the curve from where this group is. But they're still really encouraging a lot more journalists to have deeper conversations about climate and to really push action, push the urgency, and explain the issues. So they are frequently educating journalists about the issues and hosting scientists on their calls as well. So for one thing, I just really want to encourage everyone here to reach out to Covering Climate Now. I have been, submitting comments to them and asking them to cover issues like this and calling out how important it is that we focus on cooling in addition to reducing greenhouse gas and all sorts of subjects supporting HPAC. But I'm sure if there were other people in the group who reached out to them personally, especially with the scientific credentials, that could help influence them in the right direction. But they hosted a conversation the other day focusing on climate denial and also talking about the upcoming COP and how it is that the fossil fuel companies have gotten involved in that and really warning journalists about a lot of the issues and the greenwashing that has happened around COP. And they also discussed climate denial and how it is that it has really developed more of a stronghold. They've been focused on the United States and recognizing that there is a financially backed, coordinated effort to really support inaction, of course, largely supported by fossil fuel companies, but that the Conservative Party has really gone on, along and on board, and all the media companies that have kind of, followed suit. It's been really revealing to me about some issues that I had been unaware of. And I posted another conversation that should be public to be able to tap into from Jenny King, who had a really fascinating conversation about how climate denial has become such a cultural issue. Like the cultural wars have really helped make climate denial about other things, the freedom to keep your gas stove, other kinds of unrelated issues that have been, that have co-opted narratives that are supportive of inaction. So I just want to, call everyone's attention to that. I think there are deeper conversations to have around all of this, but I'm very concerned about the progress and traction that they have made, and that we don't seem to have, we have a much higher bar when it comes to the arguments that we put out than the bar that they put out in order to be effective. Did you want to respond to that, Mike?
Yeah, well, I would. So I should have mentioned when I was talking about them that the perspective of a lot of the denier community seems to be that instead of building a pyramid of knowledge, we're building a house of cards. And their view is sort of that if they can find one flawed card and pull it out, the whole thing comes down and you have to start building the whole understanding all over again. And so the house of cards is sort of the image they have, and you have to have this perfect understanding before you're going to sort of give up fossil fuels or something, which they are hung up on. But basically they're arguing you have to have perfect understanding. And if that's going to be your standard, nobody would ever drill an oil well, nobody would ever cross the street, nobody would ever do a whole bunch of things. They're applying this standard to an existential problem when that's sort of not the appropriate thing to do, and indeed that's something to point out. I mean, I used to try and talk to the diplomats, to the press corps and the media too, about what they were doing, saying, look, the way you're choosing people to speak, often without even indicating what their affiliation. I mean, okay, they'd identify this lawyer. Well, they turned out to work for the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which was all supported by fossil fuels or something. And so they were offering their perspective, and it's just so. And a lot of times they just don't explain what it is. So I was asked, well, on another blog list I'm on, more scientific, a guy said he was asked to participate in a debate. There was a guy who wanted to have a debate between a scientist and a doomer. And you go,
Right.
and he was looking for doomers or something, and they want to present all these different views, but they don't really sort of explain. I mean, they get into, they immediately get into an argument about some specific result of what you can do without sort of explaining the framing they're coming from in evaluating the problem, which is, I'm worried about the risk for my future generations and my kids or something, as opposed to I'm worried about having perfect understanding or something. And so, and people often don't admit it. It's hard you try and find a scientist who admits that the scientific traditional approach shouldn't be applied to every decision they make. I mean, every one I'm going to make, I want to know the findings. I want to know the answer. I want to understand it. I'll admit, when I, decided to ask my wife to get married, I had my reasoning all worked out. I mean, she decided in 2 minutes when she first met me or something. Different people have different ways of coming to decisions, and it's important to try and think about them and people to be aware of what they are, and so when you hold a debate, when a news person does it or tells a story, they've got to they really have an obligation to explain where the person's coming from or something. I might say one other problem with journalists, and it'll be interesting to see, is and I got into this discussion with a writer, Richard Kerr from Science Magazine some years ago. I said, I just don't like your articles. You never present the fundamental facts of what we agree on. All you're presenting is the new findings, where, of course, at the cutting edge of science, there are going to be people who disagree. You haven't proven it yet or whatever it is, but all you're doing is presenting the new findings. And he basically said, the job of news reporters is not to educate the public. Okay, that's not our job. Our job is to talk about what's new. Well, then who is obligated to talk about it? The public, and educate the public. My great-grandfather was chancellor of NYU and wrote an article back in 1880s or something, late 1880s, admiring the British for what they were doing and trying to educate the public. They had, BBC and the public broadcasting, and they only had a few channels, so you couldn't help but sort of be exposed to learn about things. And they had a public learning program even before that. And he was saying the United States needs an adult education program or something, some way of educating the public. We used to have Walter Cronkite or somebody, but we don't have that anymore. And so it's really hard. So, but reporters don't feel that's their job to educate. That's unfortunate.
Well, it's interesting. One of the things that came up is how people are so focused on the issues that are right in front of them in terms of their everyday survival and their current interests. And, we oftentimes don't address the things that are clear and present in people's lives. I mean, inflation.
Aria, sorry. I didn't realize it was muted. We gotta move along. Sorry. We only have 13 minutes, 3 more people. Sorry. Charlie, can you speak? No, it's still not working. Okay. Jonathan Cole.
Thank you. It would be historically comical if the insurance companies, the property insurance companies, were to be the ones that saved the day. I just read an article that in 2019, 20% of insurance companies had internal teams to establish climate change risk across their products. And I think by now it's probably 50%. And the beauty of insurance pricing is that it affects the rich and the poor almost in a linear fashion. To insure a $100,000 house against flooding, or to insure a $100 million apartment complex against flooding, has a somewhat linear approach. So this kind of thing will put a price to the rich on not doing anything, and on the loss of their money coming up. So I think it would be funny if the insurance companies turn out to be our greatest ally for a better solution using, cooling. So
Yeah,
I'd like
well,
to-
that's what this guy Dave Tattersall is out, appeal to their greed and their sort of responsibility, their health and their public safety. That especially, I mean, he turns out to have been in contact with the Norwegian Pension Fund, which is one of the big groups that wants to preserve its capital. But you think about, the families that are written, the Rothschilds and the others, they want to preserve their capital. They better be thinking about climate change and what influence it's happening. And this idea that, it's all going to be, everything can be worked out, as Mike Mann says, because we're going to be able to meet the 1.5 standard, as if the 1.5 standard is adequate. I mean, it's just very strange. And so this group is, Dave and his colleagues have written, some interesting reports and going to the high level people, trying to get the attention of, directors of big banks and the big international banks, and try and say, look, you guys just are not doing your work. Let's do a due diligence analysis and talk about what the complications are. And then you guys put the pressure on the politicians to act. Yeah, it would be ironic, but.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, Charlie, I just keep giving you a try here, but doesn't seem to be working. Okay, Alan.
Okay, you should have my audio and video now. Okay.
Yeah.
I want to suggest a framing that's targeted on Dick Cheney, Michael Mann, and the IPCC. So since Thanksgiving is coming up soon in the US, I'll start in terms of roasting a turkey. If you put a raw turkey in the oven at a constant temperature, starts out raw, eventually it's done just right. If you leave it in there, eventually it's burned to a crisp. So the framing I'm suggesting is, well, if you think that we're okay at 1.5 degrees C, how long do you have to roast the Thwaites Glacier at 1.5 C before it collapses? How long do you have to warm the North Atlantic at 1.5 C before the Gulf Stream collapses? Maybe a couple of examples like that. My point is, I would ask Michael Mann and the IPCC to say, all right, what are your target dates for things like that to happen? What are your uncertainties? And incorporate that into the framing of how to evaluate alternative scenarios. And as a final parting shot, in terms of how to educate the public, this is just my personal opinion. If somehow Taylor Swift could be convinced to come out strongly for cooling in the earth, I think it would be transformative. Thank you.
Yes, I mean, somehow that's the kind of thing that one can, say in letters and try and communicate to the public and try and give good understanding, give a good sense and give them something they can understand instead of the complications or something like that. I mean, so you're right. That's certainly one way to be looking at it.
Yeah, but in terms of like the suggesting that the IPCC should adopt some such criteria, one way to try to get people to consider that framing would be to put out straw man proposals that if the Earth then plateaus at 1.5 or 2 or whatever, somebody who can speak with authority on this can say, well, we think the glacial collapse is going to happen within this time range. We think the Gulf Stream collapse would happen within this time range, and challenge them to come up with their own estimates and dare them to say never as the answer to those events.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned the failure, it would have been nice if there were some official group in the world of risk analysts who could have been selected to be the responsible for putting together the summary for policymakers and using a framing and presenting that information that is what policymakers really use. Unfortunately, there just doesn't seem to have been such a group to recommend that, because they would ask those kind of questions completely separately. I heard interesting that, you know, there is this suggestion that IPCC has the people who have been writing it are getting tired of saying the same thing over and over again. And we've really got to come up with other ways. And so hopefully in the next assessment round, they start thinking about alternative ways of trying to ask the questions and you know, and what it will be. And by that time we'll be at 1.5 if you look at current things or past it.
Is it possible to self-organize a worldwide group with sufficient gravitas to sort of just unofficially give a joint opinion on some of these things, and maybe you know, get enough credibility to for people to pay attention?
I'm sorry, I missed which group you mentioned.
No, just to self-organize a currently non-existent group of people with sufficient gravitas to you know, come to some consensus of an alternative framing and put it out there and try to get people, you know, just as a straw man. And then if IPC says no, we don't like that, it'll at least
Well, that's what
kind
this
of
that's what this group that wrote the bad science paper tried to do. They basically tried to explain what it is. They're called doomers, which is unfair and pejorative by others, and that's how they'll probably be dismissed. But they certainly made an effort at it. If you read the summary they have, which I ended up spending a lot of time on with them, going back and forth, you know, it's a really interesting summary about a statement about what the problem is. The summary doesn't actually talk about bad science. I mean, that got ruled out of the summary, even though the title stayed the same. But it talks about this issue of relative risk and what the problems are in that regard. And I don't know if they're going to. I mean, they didn't run it. Well, I guess I don't know if they're putting it out to get people to sign on to it or not. But it's a very. I mean, I think they made a really good attempt at trying to do what you say, is put together something that's.
Yeah, but you know,
Alan, I think yeah. So we only have yeah, we're pretty much up against the time. Robert, did you want to make a last comment, or?
Look, I just wanted to say that we're finished time, so we need to end the meeting. I was going to make a comment, but that's okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And I think again, you know, that paper is still there. You know, it's I think they're still open to further comments. So maybe some of the thoughts that you've expressed, Mike. I know one of the authors is here. So yeah.
I never got to read the next 50 pages. I spent all of my time on
I know. Yeah.
I just
but I think they were very good comments. There's again, the first part of Simon Sharp's book that deals with a lot of this, and just the basic understanding of how probability works, right? You know, you want to minimize type 1 error. Well, that means you often expand type 2 error, which is the probability of not catching, you know, not catching things that are actually going to happen. So it's
Ron, could I ask that we end the meeting now? Like we shouldn't really go over people's time for the 90 minutes that we've allocated.
I agree.
I'd also just like to mention that that Charlie has put his comment into the chat, and so before Mike leaves, you might like to have a look at Charlie's comment in the chat, which he wasn't able to share with us in the meeting.
Thank you, Robert. Yes. Okay. Well, thank you, Mike. It was very interesting discussion, and you know, I think these are topics that really do have to be pursued, you know, thought through and dealt with, because it's a huge problem, obviously. But thank you all, and I hope you will be here. I think in 2 weeks we're going to have Bruce Melton speak. And so that should be a good talk as well. So have a good evening, and thank you, Mike, very much.